Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Yutet. Today's daf is sponsored by Rena Kors in loving memory of her father, Asher Aryeh ben Ephraim Esther, on his 9th yahrzeit. Today's daf is sponsored by Blima Storchion Slutsky in loving memory of Yitzchak Tzvi ben Blima and Chaim Shimon. Okay, we're going to get started with a very quick review. We started with the Mishnah, which gave a list of all sorts of actions that don't that don't have to be done in the mincha. Okay, that if they weren't done, the mincha is going to be kshira anyway. Then we explained lo yatzak means you don't need to do the yitzika. It doesn't mean you don't need to do yitzika at all. Pour the oil. Of course you need to do that. So they explain, what it really means is a kohen doesn't need to do it. And then we finished our sugya by saying, by the way, Rabbi Shimon disagrees with this. And then we showed Rabbi Shimon's opinion that the kohanim have to do yitzika, the pouring of the oil into that's pouring the oil onto the solet, which is the flour. So now we're going to ask, starting 3 lines from the bottom of Yud Chet Amud Bet, my time of the Rabbanan. What's the reason for the rabbis? Why do they not require a kohen? Why is it okay without a kohen? Amar Kra. So they read the pasuk like this, and then we're going to see what's really the debate between them and Rabbi Shimon. So even though we're really starting with the rabbis, we're going to actually get into a discussion about really what's the basis of Rabbi Shimon's opinion. So the rabbis say, look at the pasuk, Amar Kra. So now we're talking pasuk, Vayikra chapter 2, verses Aleph and Bet. Okay, so it says, Nefesh ki takriv korban mincha l'Hashem. I'm going to read the whole thing. If you're going to bring a korban mincha, solet yeh korbano, it's going to be solet. We'll talk a little bit later what exactly solet is. V'yatzak aleh hashemen, pour oil on it. Notice we haven't talked about a kohen yet. Okay, v'natan aleh levona, and then you put the frankincense on it. So first you pour the oil, then you put frankincense. V'hevi'ah abanei Aaron kohanim, then you bring it to the sons of Aaron the kohanim. V'kamatz misham milokum. So, okay, I'll read you the rest of this pasuk because we're going to talk about this pasuk a lot today, even though the rest is not relevant right now. So, kamatz misham milokum. So he takes a full handful, and misalta umishamna, from the solet of it and from the shemen, from its solet and its oil. Come back to this later. Al kol levonotah, with all its levona, and then he burns it. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, notice there's no kohen in the picture until pasuk Bet. So comes the rabbis and say, only from the time of kemitza does the kohen come into the picture. From there you learn that the parts before it, like the pouring of the oil, like the mixing of the oil, doesn't have to be done by a kohen. That seems pretty simple. So then what does Rabbi Shimon say? For Rabbi Shimon, b'nei Aharon HaKohanim, mikra nidrash lefanav u'lacharav. This is a principle we saw in Tzvachim, and in other places in the Gemara as well, which is a pasuk can also be explained as referring back to the previous section. So if it says before the Yitzika, and then it says the Kohanim come in and do the kemitza, we can say the Kohanim also come in, and that refers back to the previous. This is the first explanation of Rabbi Shimon. We're going to have a problem with this, and then we're going to change it. But right now, that's what we think Rabbi Shimon's position is based on. That's why I said in the end, we're going to really focus on Rabbi Shimon, because the rabbis are pretty clear. The rabbis say, okay, it's very obvious. The Kohanim only come in at the kemitza point. So before kemitza, no. And we saw this yesterday also, because we talked about that whole thing of Rav Nachman and his question and Rabbi's attempted answer, but we're going to leave that right now. Now, V'sava Rabbi Shimon, this isn't going to work. To say that that's the basis for Rabbi Shimon, because we know in a different context, he doesn't say this. Okay, he doesn't use this principle. Basically, they're saying he employs the principle. We've seen this before. There's a machloket. Does a pasuk only refer to what's coming up? Or can you say, oh yeah, this really connects with the previous section? So we're now going to show that in a different place, Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold by this principle, which means it can't be he holds by the principle here. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, v'lakacha kohen midam chatat be'etzba'o. So the kohen takes from the blood, which is Kabbalah. He accepts the blood. And then it says he takes with his finger, v'natana karnot mizbech. Now they understand v'lakach as the Kabbalah, accepting the blood. And then v'natan is placing the blood. Now where does the kohen come into the picture? Where does the etzba come into the picture? Remember etzba? Etzba means, by the way, I'll remind you of this sugya because you're gonna hear sounds of it later on in today's daf. You'll see when we get there and you'll understand what we mean. We had a whole discussion about etzba and kohen and which one needs to be done with the right hand. Is it always when it says either etzba or kohen, both etzba and kohen? In the end, we say etzba means right, even if the word kohen doesn't necessarily mean right hand, but etzba for sure does. Etzba on its own, and kohen only if it has also etzba. Does it mean right hand? So, meaning the right hand is essential. Usually the right hand is anyway, but does it have to be the right hand? If it was done with the left, is it disqualified? So the etzba comes in next to the word v'natan, not the word v'lakach. So they say, be'etzba'o v'lakach, melamed shalote kabbalah ela b'yamin. Be'etzba'o v'natan, melamed shalote mitina ela b'yamin. So the first opinion is, Mikra nidrash lefanavu lacharav. We're going to take this etzba and say it also refers to the verb in the beginning of the pasuk, the action. Also refers to the action in the second part of the pasuk. But comes Rabbi Shimon, who we're looking for. Till now, what do we say? Rabbi Shimon's supposed to hold that way because that's how he holds here. That's why he explains here that the kohen has to be there for the first part. So that you would expect him to say the same thing. It has to be done with the right hand, even Kabbalah, because he does lefanav lacharav, but he doesn't because he disagrees with the other opinion here. Amar Rabbi Shimon v'chine mar yad b'Kabbalah. It doesn't say yad in the Kabbalah part, or etzba, what they really mean here. Ho'il v'lo ne'amar yad b'Kabbalah kibel b'smol kasher. So since it doesn't say yad in the Kabbalah part, it must be if he did it with his left hand, it's still valid. Okay, again, he shouldn't, but it's valid. So we have a problem. Can't be that he holds that mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav when he doesn't hold that here. So Amar Abai, mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav kamipalge, and that's not what they're arguing about. Ela hainu tami de Rabbi Shimon. In other words, I think what Abai is saying is, sorry, I didn't read that right. Abai is saying about the machloka we just quoted is that their whole debate was about mikra nidrash lefanav ulacharav, which means that Rabbi Shimon holds it's only lacharav and not lefanav, and that contradicts what we said. So now the Gemara says, Alahainu Tama de Rabbi Shimon. So what's the reason in our pasuk then? If he really holds that generally something appears in the pasuk, it's only referring to what comes after it and not what's coming before it, then how on earth do we say that the kohen comes in before the kemitza? Doesn't say he does. Doesn't say he has to do yitzika. So he employs a different tactic here. Alahainu Tama de Rabbi Shimon vehevia. Well, it says, Yatzak ala Hashem and natan ala levona, do the yitzika, do the levona, and then it says, and bring it to the kohen. Vav, often we have this other principle, Vav mosif aliyan rishon. That means the Vav comes to connect. And since it says the kohenim in the second part, and it's introduced with the Vav, that means, and it's connected to the previous. So we bring those two together, and then we say, that's where he gets the kohen needs to do yitzika. So here was our second explanation for Rabbi Shimon, and this one's going to work. Although it won't come without questions. Okay, so now we have our answer though, just so you know. So there were two possible answers what Rabbi Shimon held. The first one was rejected because it doesn't hold up in a different case. The second one is accepted, but it also doesn't hold up in another case. Now what I'm telling you now is so you get the structure and don't get lost in the back and forth. Right now, we're going to keep this answer, but we're going to have a difficulty on it and resolve the difficulty. But there's going to be then a branch out of that as well, so you'll see. Sava Rabbi Shimon vav mosif alinyan rishon. But wait, how can you say Rabbi Shimon holds that? Elameata dichtiv vishacha. Okay, now I'm going to read you the psukim here. This is also important, and we'll read them in order. In Vayikra, the first chapter, verse 4, it tells you the order of how you're supposed to do a korban. Excuse me. We're at the beginning of Vayikra, and we're talking about how to do korbanot. And it says, this is the korban olah. It says, Vissamach. Okay, you do the smicha. Remember, smicha, that's the owner puts his hands on the korban, on the animal, when it's still alive. So it says, V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah. Okay, he puts his hands on the head of the olah, on the head of the animal. V'nirtza lo lechaper alav, and it will be an appeasement to atone for him. Then it says, V'shachat et ben bakar, and he slaughters the ben bakar. The whole question is, who does the slaughtering? Lifnei Hashem. And then what happens? Oh, and who comes and does the rest of it? Right? The kohanim. They do the Kabbalah of the blood. They do the, right, Vayikra, if you remember, means Kabbalah, according to the Midrash. They do Kabbalah, then obviously Holacha, which isn't even mentioned here, right? And then they do Zrika. So, what does it seem to appear here, right? This is, if you say Mikra Nidrash only Lacharav, then you wouldn't think that the Kohen does the Shchita. But there's a Vav here. It says, V'hikrivu b'nei Aaron. If Rabbi Shimon holds Vav, right, this is exactly the same as before. It's the same exact structure. You have an action, then the Kohanim come in, but they come in with a Vav. That would mean that Rabbi Shimon would hold that Kohanim have to do Shchita. Now, we all know, we've learned this a bunch of times, or maybe you didn't yet. But if you learn Zvachim, you know that the Kohanim do not have to do the Shchita. Shchita can be done by a Zar, by a non-kohen. It can even be done by women. Okay, women can do Shchita of Korbanot. So, it says, "V'shachat ben bakar v'krivu hakohanim et adam v'zarku et adam mikava alav ve'elach mitzvah kuna milamed shchita shekshera b'zar." Okay, now here you have the drasha, and nobody disagrees with that. Rabbi Shimon doesn't disagree with that. Shchita can be done by a non-kohen. So they say, "Ila Rabbi Shimon vav mosif l'inyan rishon." Here's the question: if he holds the vav connects the previous, then shchita hachinami b'zar tiye psula. So the shchita should be disqualified. It should have to be done by a kohen. To which the Gemara answers, Shane Hatam, that's different. Why? Ta'amar Kran, this is why I read you that pasuk first, V'samach. It says V'samach v'shachat. Now it's true there's a vav after v'shachat, but there's also a vav of v'shachat which connects to V'samach. Now we know that smicha, okay, if smicha has to be done by the owner, then it obviously is done by a zar, because most owners of korbanot, right, the vast majority, statistically speaking, will be non-kohanim. So, Da'amar krav v'samach v'shachat, so that connects smicha, the shchita to the smicha. Ma shchita b'zarim, av shchita b'zarim. Okay, so that resolved our problem. So even though vav mosif l'inyan rishon, it doesn't in this case, because the vav in v'shachat connects it to the previous, and it's just like v'samach. Now we're going to get off on a question on that, okay? But we'll come back and this still stands, okay? But we're going to have a question within this. It's going to raise a difficulty, but we'll resolve it. If we're really learning smicha from shchita, then we should take it all the way, which means what? What did I say? Who does the smicha? The owner. Okay, get this one. They're going to suggest that maybe the shchita has to be done by the owner. Thankfully, they don't paskin this way, right? If you wanted to bring a korban, right, hard enough to visualize bringing korbanot, but you'd actually have to slaughter it yourself. Okay, so they're going to say, Ima smicha bebalim. If you're really going to learn from smicha, and smicha is from the owner only, av shchita bebalim, then we're going to say the shchita should be done by the owner, not just that it can be done by a non-kohen, has to be done by the owner of the korban. Okay, which we know is not true. So we're going to have two possible answers. The first one we're going to have an issue with, and therefore we'll bring a second one. Hahu lo matzid amr. So you can't possibly say that. Why not? Kavachomer, because you can make a kavachomer argument against it. What's the kavachomer argument? Well, mazrika di ikar kapara lo baya baalim shrita de lavi kar kapara lo koshaken. If the zrika, which is the main way you get atonement, that's the main activity for atonement. We've learned that many times in Tzvachim. Zrika is it. The sprinkling of the blood, that's how you get atonement. And that doesn't need to be done by, it can't be done by the owner, right? For most, 98% of the situations, or I don't know the percentage. How many korbanot were brought by Kohanim or not. But most of them are not done by the owner. So, shchita, which is not even such a major part of the getting of atonement, it's more like a prerequisite, right? You can't bring the blood unless you slaughter it. Lo koshaken, all the more so that it should not have to be done by the owner, right? If the zrika doesn't need to be done by the owner, then shchita not. This is a bad argument. Why is it a bad argument? Because v'chitema ein danim efshal mishe'i efshal. Well, if you hold, and there's a whole machloket about this, can you make a derivation from something like a kavachomer argument from a case where it's not possible, right? Zrika can't be done in, like I said, a high percentage of the cases can't be done by the owner. So that's an impossibility. But shchita, theoretically, you could require that. It's definitely possible because shchita could be done by a non-kohen. So you could require the owner. So you can't learn from shchita from zrika when zrika can't. It's not possible, right? If it was possible and we said you don't need it, that's one thing. But if it's not even possible, well, you can't learn one from something that's possible from something that's impossible. So there's a machloket whether you could do that or not. And that's why this is only a partial knockout of this answer. But it's enough of a knockout of an answer that the Gemara is going to bring a different one. Well, Gali Rachmana b'Yom Kippurim. They're going to give a different type of drasha here. They're going to say, well, the reason how we know that shechita doesn't have to be done by the owner is because the Torah specifies specifically on Yom Kippur that v'shachat et par chatat asher lo, who slaughters the chatat, the Kohen's sin offering, the Kohen Gadol's, the Kohen Gadol himself. And it says so in the pasuk. Now, if shechita always had to be done by the owner, it wouldn't need a special pasuk saying the Kohen Gadol has to slaughter his own korban on Yom Kippur. The fact that it says it is an indicator that it's not obvious, okay? And that it's not the case in other cases. Forget it's not obvious, it's just not the case. And here's an exception to the rule, and that's why it specifies the exception. Okay, Michlal, from there you can infer the shechita ba'alma lo b'inam ba'alim. And that's how you can infer that shechita in general doesn't need owners. So let's just go through the structure of what we did. We brought the machloket between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon. Yitzika, is it have to be done by a kohen or not? We explained what's the logic behind it, which is rabbis say it didn't appear in the pasuk yet. Rabbi Shimon said, right, the kohanim didn't appear. Rabbi Shimon says it did because the vav connects it to the previous. We first thought Rabbi Shimon had to do with, can you connect, without the vav? Would you say, oh, this word connects with both the next part and the previous? That we proved can't be. So we ended with the vav. We questioned that from v'shachat, but we said, oh, v'shachat is really learned from v'samach. But why don't we learn it completely from v'samach, that even the owner? And then we explained two possible reasons. If Zerika doesn't need the owner, the shechita doesn't. Or if you're not going to accept that because that's not the best comparison, because it's impossible. But we could say from Yom Kippur you learn it because there it's specifically said. It wouldn't need to be specifically said if that was the rule in general. Okay, now we're moving on. Rav says a principle. Since we're talking about, in this Mishnah, all sorts of things that are essential, or not, really we were talking about what's not essential. Right? From there you can learn also what is essential. But we were talking about what's not essential. What's the litmus test? How do we know what's essential, what's not essential? And this is something we discussed a lot in Zvachim also. Right? There's a lot of details of korbanot. Some of them are essential, some of them aren't. How do we know? So Rav brings a principle, and then within this discussion we're going to get to a second principle of Rav, which is going to be the second part of the next part of today's stuff. But Amar Rav, Kol makom shenemar Torah v'chuka eino ela la'akev. And this is why I reminded you of the etzba and kohen. It's the same idea here. Okay? Anytime it says the word Torah and chukah, that means it's essential. Okay. At first, when they heard what Rav said, they assumed, and this is the exact same thing they did with etzba and kohen. We said anytime it says etzba and kohen, what did they think? You need both etzba and kohen. Same thing here. They thought he meant tarte be'ina, both of them. Kidichtiv zot chukat Torah. And they give an example, like for example, in the beginning of Parsha Chukat, which is the section about para aduma, the red heifer. It says this is chukat haTorah. So if you have chukah and you have Torah together, it's ma'akev. Okay, again ma'akev. I'll just keep using this word. Ma'akev means it's essential. If you don't do it, the korban's disqualified. So now we're going to start with 4 difficulties on that assumption. We're going to basically adjust that assumption just like we did in the etzba and kahuna case 2 times. Okay, we're going to have 3 possibilities in Rav. We're going to move from 1 to 2 to 3. Okay, in other words, it's not going to be these are 3 options. We're going to say we thought it was 1. We raised 4 difficulties. The 3 difficulties we can resolve. The 4th we won't be able to resolve. We're going to move from there to a different reading of Rav. We're going to question that and knock it out with 1 difficulty. We're going to go to the 3rd reading, understanding of what Rav meant. We're going to have a difficulty within that, but we're going to resolve that. Okay, so that's our structure. And then we're going to mention one thing in that last part, and then we're going to go into a gufa about that. We're going to say, okay, let's talk about that now. And that's going to lead into tomorrow's stuff. So that's our structure for the rest of today. Rav says, Komakom, so we said, okay, they thought it meant anytime it says both Torah and chukah. The first 3 difficulties are going to be places where it says Torah, not chukah, okay? And it is going to be ma'akev, okay? The 4th one is going to be chukah without Torah, and it's also ma'akev. So let's go through the structure. Hari Nazir, delokti be ela Torah. Okay, Nazir, it says Zotorat Nazir. These are the rules of the Nazir, right? Torah really means in those contexts, these are the rules. Va'amarav, tnufa b'Nazir ma'akevet. You have to do a waving in the Nazir process. That's essential. So it only said Torah, and we said Torah and chukah. That's how we understood Rav. Say, no, Shani Hatam, that's an exception to the rule. Each time that's going to be our answer. Oh, this is exceptional. Why? Shani means shoneh. It's different here. Kevan dichtiv, or actually Hatam is there. Okay, there in the Nazir case, it's different. Kevan dichtiv kein ya'aseh. This is how it should be done. Okay, that makes it pretty clear. It has to be done this way. Keman dichtiv be chukah dami. So it must be as if it says chukah. Okay, Doesn't say chukah, it just says Torah, but it also says king yaseh. That changes the status into essential. Question number 2. Harei todah, the korban todah. Delokti be'ela Torah. Okay, it says zot Torah zevach hashlamim. These are the rules for the shlamim. And the next pasuk says, if you're bringing a korban todah. So there you have Torah introduces that section. Utnan, arba'ah shebetodah makvin zeh. There's 4 types of loaves. Those who went to the mincha workshop, we made 3 of them. Okay, there's 4 different types of loaves. You have to have all 4 types. Shane Torah, todah de'it takesh l'nazir. But that's essential because there's a hekesh. We're going to see exactly what this is. A juxtaposition. It's not a classic juxtaposition of Nazir and Korban Todah. Now you think, where on earth would the Torah compare Nazir and Todah? Well, you'll see. Dichtiv, al zevach todat shlamav. Okay, this is a pasuk which says about the chalot lechem chametz that you bring. Yakriv korbano al zevach todat shlamav. You bring your korban on the zevach. Okay, you bring these loaves with the zevach shlamav. Now, shlamav is plural, but you're really bringing one korban todah, one korban shlamim. So why is it plural? It's to say shlamav includes amar. Someone explained there shlamav l'rabot shalmei nazir. So it's not exactly a juxtaposition where 2 things are mentioned in the pasuk next to each other. 2 things are referenced in one word. Okay, the word shlamav includes the shlamim of a nazir and the shlamim because the nazir also comes with loaves. Okay, so it's mentioning both those. Okay, so now that shows that the nazir, and that's why the nazir is compared to Todah, because they both come with loaves. One has 40 loaves, the nazir only has 20 loaves, but it's still this idea they come with these mincha offerings. Okay, so now they're compared in the pasuk, and therefore whatever we answer for nazir is going to be the answer here, basically, because it says ken yaseh by nazir, and that's essential. This is essential as well. Mitzora kimandachti bechukadami. Okay, I skipped a few lines. Hare mitzora delokti be'ela Torah. Okay, so mitzora zot Torah mitzora. This is what the mitzora does when they finish b'yom tarato on the day he's pure and he has to do this whole ceremony. Utnan arba'a minim. Okay, these are not the 4 species of the arba minim that we know from Sukkot, but there's 4 things that you have to put in the thing. You need the 2 birds, you need the ezov, you need the tolat shani, and you need the eitz erez. Okay, you need like these 4 things in the mitzvah. Ma'akvin zetze. Those are essential. You can't do the purification process without all 4 of those items. Okay, but it just says Torah. Well, Shanehatan Kivan Dachtiv Zot Tihiyeh Torah Mitzorah. In most of the places in the Torah it says Zot Torah Mitzorah, Zot Torah, or it doesn't say Zot Torah Mitzorah, but it says Zot Torah Nazir, Zot Torah Chatat, Zot Torah. Okay, here it says Zot Tihiyeh Torah Mitzorah. This will be is a stronger word that's adding something. What's it adding? This makes Torah it makes it Kiman Dachtiv Bechukadami. It's as if it says Chukah. Okay, it's just the same. Even though it's not exactly the same, but it means the same idea. So in these 3 cases, just to summarize, we brought 3 cases where it said just Torah. It didn't say Chukah. And we thought that Rav was saying Torah and Chukah is necessary to say it's ma'akev, and we brought that there's halachot in all these 3 areas that are essential, even though it just says Torah. But we said because it says v'chein yaseh, and because that one's learned from that one, and because it says tiyeh, those are exceptions to the rule. But normally, if it just says Torah, it's not essential. Okay, 4th question though, which is going to put us in a bind. Hare Yom Kippurim delokti be'ela chukah. Okay, this is a very famous pasuk because it says at the end of the section, right? The zot vayita lachem lechukat olam b'yechodesh hashvi'i be'asor lechodesh shanu nafshotechem. Okay, and it also says it. Yeah, it says it twice. It says if zot lachem lechukat olam lechaper al bnei Israel. This is really the pasuk I was thinking of. I don't know. It's interesting they bring both, but it says basically, at the end of the section, this will be for you who rule forever. And everybody says, from there we get that it's ma'akev. Now the word Torah is absent from there. It never says Torah. It just says chukah. And the whole idea is that all these things we said in the section about Yom Kippur is essential. It has to be done in that way. So how do we explain that? And now they bring an example. Okay, you have to have the 2 goats. You don't have, right? Remember, one gets sacrificed to God, one gets thrown off of the cliff. So if you don't have both, it's not, right? It's not good. You're not yotze. So Ella o Torah o Chukah. Okay, so now they change it because now they're stuck. So now they say, okay, forget what we said. It doesn't mean Torah and chukah. It means either Torah or chukah. And then that could resolve all our difficulties that we had before. We don't need all those explanations that we had. But they say, wait a minute, that's not true. Because every time it says Torah, it's essential. What do you mean? Hare shar korbanot tichtivu Torah v'lo ma'akve. All the korbanot, Zot Torah Chatat, Zot Torah Hasham, right? They all are introduced with Zot Torah Olah, and they're not, every detail of them is not essential. So how can you say that? So now they say, okay, fine, you're right, not true. Okay, so let's adjust it one more time. This is what I told you. We're going to have two different adjustments to eventually have three different opinions. First we said either Torah. At first you need both Torah, both chukah. Then we went to the other extreme. You need either Torah or chukah. Then we get to the same conclusion we have with the etzba, which is Torah baya chukah, chukah lo baya Torah. Torah needs chukah. If you have Torah, that's not enough, like we just showed with all the korbanot. You also have to have the word chukah. Now we have to go back and reinstate all those answers for the first three questions of where it just said Torah and it's ma'akev. Okay, those are for different reasons. But chukah, like in Yom Kippur, lo baya Torah, it's enough on its own. Okay, obvious question, right? And they kind of ask it in different words, but Torah v'chukah ka'amar. But then why bother mentioning Torah? Basically, like he said Torah and chukah you need. So it's hard to say Torah needs chukah, but chukah doesn't need Torah, when really what you're saying is all you need is the word chukah. That would be enough. So it doesn't make any sense. So they say hachi kamar. Af agav diktiv Torah. What they want to say is, even though it says Torah, don't think that means it's ma'akev. Ktiva chuka'in, ilo lo. If you see the word Torah, okay, keep looking. And if you find the word chukah also, yes, it's going to be ma'akev. If you don't find the word chukah, it won't be. Okay, so that's our answer. But now we're going to have a difficulty. V'harei mincha. Dichtiv b'chukah. It says chukah by mincha, which would mean it's all essential. Now we know it's not, because we just read in the Mishnah that there's all these things that are not essential. And Rav said somewhere else, and this is the statement of Rav we're going to get off on later, which is, Kol makom she'achzir haTorah b'Torah mincha eino ela la'akev. Anytime the Torah repeated something, it's to tell you it's ma'akev. Now many things in the mincha are repeated, mostly because it's mentioned in chapter 2. As I told you, it's mentioned in chapter 6. If anyone wants some homework over Shabbat, you can just read through, if you haven't already, the verses in chapter 2 of the Mincha, the verses in chapter 6. If you remember, we talked about the beginning ones are really toward the people. If you want to bring a Korban Mincha, this is what you have to do. And in Vayikra Vav, it's already Parshat Tzav, which is Tzav to Kohanim, and it's the perspective of the Kohanim about the Mincha, like what parts they can eat and all that. So you can read them through and see, because now it'll make a lot more sense to you now that we've already started learning this. So anyway, Mincha, it says chukah, and Rav said, what's the test for how do we know which parts are essential, which are not, which leads us kind of to our Mishnah, right, which said this yes, this no, okay, or really it said this isn't essential. It listed all those things that aren't essential. Well, he says if it repeats it, it's ma'akev. And this we saw in Kodesh, in Zvachim also. We said that's like a general principle for Kodesh. If something is repeated twice, that means it's essential. Hichzir, now, what's the problem here? Well, it says chukah, which should be means it's ma'akev. So then why did Rav say anytime it says things twice, which seems to indicate hichzir in lo, hichzir lo? Only if it's repeated twice is it ma'akev. But if it's not repeated twice, it's not. And yet, he says it says chukah, and that's an indicator of, right? So all these things, whether they're repeated twice or not, they should be essential. So they say, Shanei hatam dechiktiv chukah. We're going to have two answers to this question. The first one won't be fully satisfactory, and therefore we'll bring another one. Shanei hatam dechiktiv chukah a'achila ktiva. When it says chukah in the section of the Mincha, it was talking about when the Kohanim eat the korban. Okay? You can look at the pasuk. It's in Vayikra Kaf Daled pasuk Tet. Anyway, I'm not going to read it inside because we don't have a lot of time, but the point is, it comes up in a pasuk, Ki Chok Olam, and it's about the Kohanim eating. Eating is not the same as doing the avoda, so the context is different. If it was in the context of doing the avoda, the rituals, that would be a different story. So we can finally ignore the chok there. I said, what do you mean? Hare lechem apanim, techiktiv chuka. Oh, sorry, I quoted the wrong pasuk. The pasuk we were looking for was Vayikra Vav Yud Aleph. The one Kaf Dalet that I just quoted is the one about the lechem apanim. My mistake. So I just looked at the wrong place here. So anyway, in Vayikra, right, chapter 6, it talks about chok in the context of eating, and it's not essential. But when it comes to the lechem apanim, chok also appears in the context of eating, and it is essential. Okay? Utnan, shnei starim makvin zetzeh, shnei bezichim makvin zetzeh, starim vebezichim makvin zetzeh. You need the 2 sets of the 6 loaves, you need the 2 bowls of frankincense, and you need, you can't have one with one bowl of frankincense and not the other, you can't have one set of 6 and not the other set of 6, and you can't have the bezichim without the breads, or the breads without the bezichim. So you see it's all essential, and it says chukah in the context of food. So it obviously is essential. So that doesn't answer our question about the mincha, because it says chok, and it should be essential for that reason, and not when it's repeated yes, when it's not repeated no, and okay, so different answer. So they say, fine, so forget that. When it says achila, it really is talking even about the avoda. But shane hatam da amakra migarsa umishamna. We're going to go with Rashi's interpretation here. It's a little hard to understand. That's why different interpretations. Migarsa means it's the same as misalta. It's the solet, which is this flour. We'll talk about in a minute what exactly it is, which is the parallel in the omer, the korban omer, which was done with barley. The parallel word is migarsa. It's translated as groats. Okay, it's basically this kind of a bit of a thicker flour, not as powdery. Okay, maybe I'll just already say it right now what it means. So if you went to the bread workshop, they showed us how it works, which is they sifted it many, many times. But the last sifter was the sifter. Usually when you sift, you want what comes out of the sifter. The last sifter they used in the mincha offerings was to get this solet, which I always thought was defined as fine flour, meaning it was more, so it is fine in the sense they sifted a lot, but at the last sifter, they actually let out the bad stuff, and you're left with what's at the top. And what's the bad stuff, or for them bad, it's the powdery, right? You all know flour is incredibly powdery. It always makes a mess when you're using it. The solet and the garsa, the grisim, which are from the barley, was a very fine sand-like flour, which was, maybe I shouldn't say fine, it's actually thicker, sand-like, and not powdery at all. Okay, that's what it means, migarsa mishamna. Now, what does this have to do with anything here? Well, it should say the geres and the shemen, the groats and the oil. But it says it's groats, it's oil. So from there they learn, Rashi says, what this is coming to teach you is the measurement, the amount you need is essential. Now, if it specifically had a word to say that, Rashi says it well, the fact that they needed to write it this way to tell you how much you put in is essential, Shema mina chuka didei lav chuka, says something fascinating. It's telling that the word chuka here doesn't work like it usually works. Okay? And that's really our answer to our question. Chuka, even though it appears, so in other words, again, our theory is that what did Rav mean? He meant either chuka or Torah and chuka, which really means just chuka. So if the word chuka appears, it's essential. In the mincha, it's not. Why not? Well, because there's a special pasuk that says migar sa'om misham now, which basically says only this is, I'm telling you, this is essential. Now, there are other things essential as well, which is, remember, it's either because it says migar sa'om misham now, that basically overrides chuka and says chuka doesn't mean chuka like it means in other places. Migar sa'om misham now says this is essential. And then the other test is, well, did it repeat itself? If it repeats itself, then yes, it's essential. If it doesn't, it's not. So now we're going to deal with that. So turning now to Amibet, the first line I'm not going to read because it doesn't seem to belong here. Okay, there's a bunch of commentaries that remove it, like Shita Mekubetza and others. It doesn't seem to belong here at all. Okay, so because you'll see in a minute that it actually is in the name of Shmuel. If we read it now, it would be Rav, and Rav disagrees with Shmuel. So we're going to ignore that line. Now we're going to go Gufa, and we're going to go into depth into Rav, and we're going to continue with this in tomorrow's daf as well. Amar Rav. So now we're going back to Gufa Israel. We're linking into something we said before. So anytime it repeats something in the mincha, it's to say this is essential. Ushmuel amar, geres v'shemen makvin ve'ein davar acher ma'akev. The first way we're going to understand Shmuel is a simple way. He's saying only the geres and the shemen, and according to Rashi, he doesn't mean what we said before about it, the shear, how much. What he means is the fact that you need geres, you need these groats, the specific type of flour, and not the powdery one, and oil, that is essential. And it sounds like he's saying nothing else. That's the only thing that's essential in the mincha offering. So Rav is basically saying anytime it repeats. And Shmuel is saying only this issue of which kind of flour and that you need it and that you need the oil. That's the only essential parts. Obviously in the minchas that you need oil. Okay, some of them don't require oil. So now the Gemara is going to have some issues with Shmuel. Wait a minute. L'Shmuel afagav detani beikra lo ma'akva. Wait a minute. Shmuel thinks that if it repeats it, like they think this is a basic principle. We learned it all over Zvachim also. If it says it twice, it's repeated, it's not essential. What do you mean? Okay, so fine. So they say, okay. He really did mean, when he said only Geras and Shemen, he was trying to say something else, okay? He was basically trying to say this and not something else. He wasn't saying this and nothing else, okay? Because there's lots of things he thinks are Ma'akev. But what he's saying is, I take issue with Rav on one thing in particular. I'm disagreeing with you about one issue, and you'll see why in a minute. Okay, they're basically going to disagree about, is this considered repeated or is it not considered repeated? And you'll understand in a minute. They're arguing over this drasha about the words melo kumtso and bikumtso. So what does this mean? Detanya. Okay, it says in the Braita, melo kumtso bikumtso. What do you learn from the fact that one time it called it a full handful and the other one it says in a handful, which is unclear, right? One seems to be part of a like not a full handful, one seems to be a full handful. They learn this drasha, which I'm not going to get into right now much, but we're just going to read it. Shelo yasem midala comments. What it means is you can't use a measuring utensil to get the comments out. You have to use your hand. Right? Rav Savar ha namitana bekla. This is actually repeated. By the way, Melokumso and Bikumso appear in totally different sections. One is in Vayikra Bet and one is in Vayikra Vav, these two different chapters. Okay, but that's not really important for our purposes right now. The point is, from those two psukim, though, you get to this rule. Now, this rule is repeated somewhere else. Where is it repeated? Well, it's repeated in the mincha offering brought when they did the dedication of the temple, which was a one-time event. So, Vayikra mincha v'yamalei kapo mimenu, and he fills up his hand with it. Okay, so now what do you see? You have to do it with your hand. And the other one taught you have to do it with your hand. That's repeated. That means it's essential. So if you do the komitz with a vessel, obviously we know it's not done with a vessel because we learned it's a special avoda the kohen does, how he does the komitz. But is that essential? What if the kohen didn't do it that way and he put a measuring cup in and scooped out a handful? Would that be okay? So Rav says, no way, no how. It's repeated. Shmuel says, Dorot misha'ah lo yofina. Shmuel says that's not repeated. Repeated is, for example, it says it in Shmuel Bet and it says, Vayikra Bet and Vayikra Vav. Those two sections would talk about all the general minchas and all the rules for future generations. But if it repeats it in a section talking about a one-time event that happened when they dedicated the temple, that's not called repeated. Makes sense, right? It's logical. So he says that, so they have this machloket. Do we say that it said it twice about the hand, so therefore it's essential? Or Shmuel says no. And when he said, now we're going back, when he said, Geres v'shamim ma'akvim ve'ein davar acher ma'akev, davar acher doesn't mean everything else. It was one thing isn't ma'akev, and he was trying to say the fact that you have to do it with your hand is not essential. And that he disagreed with Rav about. And that resolved our problem with how could Shmuel not say if something's repeated. Now we're going to have one small question on this, and then we're going to go to a difficulty on Rav. The first difficulty on Rav, the second one will be in tomorrow's daf. So Shmuel, Dorot misha'ah lo yofina, wait a minute. Does Shmuel really not learn from things that are mentioned one-time events? Look, V'lo yalev Shmuel Dorot misha'ah v'hatnan, doesn't it say in a Mishnah? We learned this. It says in a Mishnah, and we actually had it not only in Zvachim, but we learned it already in Menachot. Right, we learned it in Chedamabet. Klei halach mekachin et halach umidot hayavesh mekachin et hayavesh ve'en klei halach mekachin et hayavesh ve'en midot hayavesh mekachin et halach. All these measuring utensils, the dry ones, only sanctify the dry ones. Remember, these are sanctified vessels in the temple that we use to measure things. So, like the log shemen, right? You put it into the log measuring cup. So when you put the oil into the log measuring cup, it's a liquid measuring cup, it sanctifies it. But if you stuck flour in the log measuring cup, it wouldn't make it sanctified because it doesn't belong there. But Amar Shmuel, you're ready for Shmuel, and we're going to see the problem. Lo shane ala midot. That's only measuring utensils. Aval mizrikot, but the bowls, mikachin, sanctify. How do we know? Dichtiv. Shnehem aleim solet, because it talked about the mizrakot in the context of the gifts the nisi'im, the heads of each tribe, brought during the Chanukah Mizbeach and Parshat Naso, when it repeats it 12 times, and it says everybody brought this, that, the right? They all brought the same sacrifice, and with all sorts of mincha offerings, and it says they're both filled with solet. Now they're bowls, and they filled them with solet. So what do you see? they sanctify them, obviously, in those vessels. So bowls could sanctify even things. Normally the bowls were used for the blood, but they could sanctify the meal offerings as well. So what do you see? He learns a rule from something that was a one-time event. So they're going to answer an interesting answer. Shanehatam detane bekra tresar zimnin. Well, there it's repeated 12 times. So because it's repeated 12 times, we're going to call that an exception to the rule. Yes, so even though, right, it really is, so in general, we're not going to learn from somewhere else, but the fact that it's from a one-time event, the fact that it says it 12 times, because it says by each tribe, it's kind of ramming it into your heads, this can work. Okay, and therefore he learns it. So that was Shmuel. We dealt with Shmuel. We thought he was saying one thing, that nothing else is ma'akev. We said can't be. It must be if things are repeated. He thinks that as well. So we said the only issue he takes is this one issue where it's repeated in a context of a one-time event, and that's his machloka with Rav. Okay, now we're going to get back to Rav, who basically says this principle, anytime something is repeated, it's essential. So now we're going to say, and we're going to do the same thing in tomorrow's daf, we're going to say, Amar le Rav Kana v'Rav Asi le Rav, Hare Hagasha, bringing it to the altar. Now, do you remember Hagasha is mentioned in our Mishnah? Lo higish. If lo higish, it's kshera. It's not essential. If you didn't do that, bringing it to the mizbeach, it's okay. Titana bekha v'lo ma'akvin. As you're supposed to bring it and place it down on the floor, next to we're going to see exactly where in a minute. Now, it's repeated, and yet it's not ma'akev. Okay, where is it repeated? Man tanebe. Where do you see it repeated? Dichtiv. It's actually interesting. They only tell you one pasuk, but they tell you the repeat pasuk. Okay, the first pasuk is in chapter 2, verse 8. It says, Vayikra et mincha b'kriva el kohen v'higisha el mizbeach. So there, I think the reason why they don't quote the first one is because the first one, I guess, is the first time it's mentioned. And it also says the word v'higish. The second pasuk is actually not going to say the word higish, but higish means to bring it, and we're going to have a different word that says the same thing. It's going to say hikriv. So here's the second pasuk. This one is in chapter 6, as I told you. We have a lot of repeats between 2 and 6. Zot Torah mincha, hakrev ota b'nei Haron lifnei Hashem. Okay, so this is the Torah of the mincha. Hakrev ota lifnei Hashem. Bring it before God. Where's before God if not by the altar? Okay, bring it to the altar. It actually says lifnei Hashem el pnei hamizbeach, opposite the altar. This might sound familiar. If not, don't worry. We're going to remind you of it if you learned Tzvachim. So they say, that's not called a second thing, and we're going to do this tomorrow as well. That's not called a repeat because that pasuk is needed for something else. If that pasuk is needed for a whole drasha, then it's a different story. That doesn't mean it's repeated. Okay, for this I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you some pictures from the Mechana Mikdash, or one picture in particular, of the Mizbeach. Okay, and I want to show you now... this is going to help us with understanding this bright. They're basically going to say, we needed that pasuk to teach you, hahu likbala makom huda'ata. This is coming to teach you where exactly you're supposed to bring it. Okay? And now they're going to explain. Detanya, lifnei Hashem. Okay, it says before God. Now, what would before God be? What we're looking right now at this picture is a picture of the altar. Okay, the ramp is on the south side. So this is south right here. Okay, I'm going to actually use the features here. Okay, this is south right here. Okay? This is south, and over here is west, where I put the second X. Now this is west. This, actually I'm going to switch to black so you can see it better. Okay, this is west over here. Okay, I'm not going to write fully because I don't have time, but this is west. Now, how do we know it's west? Because those steps, you can't see it, but I wanted to at least show you, I found a picture where at least you see the steps coming down from the Heichal, okay, from actually the Ulam, which leads to the Heichal. This is the sanctuary. So when you walk out of the sanctuary, you're walking right here, okay? Now, this sugya is going to all depend on where the Mizbeach is. Obviously, in the picture, the Mizbeach is situated where it's situated, okay? But we remember that there's a whole debate about where exactly the Mizbeach is situated. So that's going to be relevant here. So, Lifnei Hashem Yachol B'Ma'arav. If you say before God, that seems like on the west side, right, where you get out of, right? So this is the west side of the altar. Be anywhere on the west side, you can bring it to there. Well, but it says, Talmud Lomar, Pnei Mizbeach. It says, facing the Mizbeach. Now, facing the Mizbeach is from the south, because that's the face of the Mizbeach where you go onto the Mizbeach. So now it's confusing. So it sounds like you could do it in the south. But Talmud Lomar, if you're in the south, over here, let's say on this side, okay, that's the south, you're not exactly El Pnei Hashem, right? Pnei Hashem is kind of, assume that here's the borders of the exit of the Heichal over here. So if you're on the west, you're Lifnei Hashem. If you're on the south, you're here. So haketzad migisha bekeren dromit maravit k'neged chudash shel keren v'dayo. So they say basically, and you'd have to imagine that the Mizbeach is a little bit over to the north side, somewhat over, and then this southwest corner would be actually fulfilling both. Now, you can't do it on the whole side of the west, can't do it on the whole side of the south. You can only do it right at the corner, where again, if you move the Mizbeach a little bit over from the way this picture is showing it, you would end up, that would cover both. Okay, you would be both before Hashem and El Panei Mizbeach. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachol Yigishanu, and basically again, this is all just to tell us what that pasuk is for, and that it's not free to say, oh, it's repeated. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yachol Yigishanu l'marava shel keren o l'droma shel keren. Maybe, right, he's saying maybe you could do it anywhere on the west side or anywhere on the south side. Amarta, but then he says, no, but it says, Kol makom she'ata motzei shnei mikraot, if you have two psukim, in this case we mean two phrases in one pasuk. Echad mekayem atzmo mekayem chavero. If you go in one direction of parshanut, you could say that could actually fit with both. But the other way, it's mekayem atzmo umevatel chavero, it can only fulfill one and not the other. Well, menichim et shemakayem atzmo mevatel chavero v'tofsim et shemakayem atzmo makayem chavero. In other words, if you have two possibilities, one is I can explain this pasuk in a way that both make sense, or one is I could say, well, it'll only make half the pasuk make sense and not the other half. Obviously, we're going to choose the one that makes both make sense. So, therefore, he says, K'shata omer lifnei Hashem b'ma'arav bitalta et pnei hamizrach b'darom. You can't possibly be anywhere on the west side here and fulfill, right, unless you're in the corner, and fulfill before El Panei Mizbeach, because Panei Mizbeach is south, and if you're anywhere on this west side, you can't possibly fulfill that. But K'shata omer El Panei Mizbeach b'darom kiyamta lifnei Hashem. But if you go anywhere on the south side, okay, you could be anywhere here on the south side, you could actually fulfill before God, because you're opposite the entrance of the Hechal, to which they say Hecha Kiyamte. Okay, certainly not in this picture, right? You're not opposite the entrance. Amar Rav Ashi Kasavar Haitana Kulem Mizbeach B'Tzafon Kai. He holds that the whole, okay, this whole square part of the Mizbeach is all on the north side. Now, if it's all on the north side, then when you walk out of the Hechal, right, you're exactly opposite the south side. And then basically any part of this side could be considered El Lifnei Hashem. So that's why he says you can't do it anywhere you want on the west side, because you're not going to fulfill facing the Mizbeach. But you could do it anywhere on the south side, assuming that the south side, that the Mizbeach is completely in the north. And then basically what you're saying is, right, the southern tip of it is basically opposite the entrance of the Hechal, and then you could fulfill both, and that's his opinion. This was all just to say that this pasuk is needed for that drasha, and it's not there to say it can be done twice. So let's review our daf. Okay, we're going to start next with another question. Oh, what about the salting? That says it twice. Actually, we're going to say doesn't say it twice, and it is essential. We're going to have the opposite issue. Okay, so now we had the machloket, the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon about Yitzika. It's have to be done by a kohen. Does not. What's the base of the machloket? And in the end, we said it's the vav. Mosif l'yam rishon. We then moved to Rav, who says Torah and Chukah. We went through till we got to the third explanation. It's really Chukah, and Torah only if it says Chukah is essential. We had an issue of the mincha right before that. We had all sorts of difficulties till we changed everything. Then we had the what about the mincha though? And it's only, and then we said, oh, that's because it says Migar Sal Misham, now showing that the Chukah here doesn't do what the Chukah normally does. Within that context, we got to this thing about it's Migar Sal Mishamna, and Rav said, and anytime it's repeated, and that's what we started dealing with now. It's Machlok at Rav and Shmuel. Rav says anytime it's repeated. Shmuel actually agrees mostly when it's repeated, but not when it's repeated l'dorot. And therefore, we had this one issue with him about the one we learned from the other pasuk, and from there we basically started questioning Rav about this principle of his and resolved it. But now we're going to continue with that, and wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and the shir for Shabbat is already up.